and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man trawling through the weird and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this episode sees me once again delving into the voluminous output of the Asylum, the low-budget movie company best known for their mockbusters, films deliberately designed to be confused with other larger-budget endeavours coming out at the same time. They're often seen as the worst film company of all time, but I think that's a little harsh because their business model does at least revolve around releasing movies, unlike Warner Brothers, who seem to prefer to write movies off for tax reasons and stop people watching their TV shows whenever that's possible. In this episode, we are looking at arguably the most important movie in the history of the Asylum, which is H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds from 2005, an adaptation of the enormously influential 1897 novel of the same name. It just so happened that in 2005 Paramount was also producing a film of War of the Worlds, a big-budget Spielberg spectacular starring everyone's favourite cultist Tom Cruise. This wasn't the first time that the Asylum had dipped their toes in the mockbuster genre. They had already marketed an adaptation of Sheridan Le Furneaux's famously queer vampire story Carmilla as Vampires vs. Zombies to cash in on Freddy vs. Jason, which was currently in the cinema. But the Asylum version of War of the Worlds was a little different. Firstly, it was extremely successful, with Blockbuster allegedly ordering 150,000 copies. And secondly, unlike Vampires vs. Zombies, where there was only an extremely limited connection between the title and the actual film it was promoting, they could actually make a version of War of the Worlds, which hewed as closely to the source material as they wanted without treading on the intellectual property of the Paramount movie. This would be the first, but by no means the last time, the Asylum benefited from elements of another film's source material being in the public domain. Before we get properly started, I do need to thank a couple of kind souls who have supported me over on patreon.com/HJDoom. The first is a new patron, Kian, and the second, Simone, has increased her pledge, and their generosity is very important to keeping this show on the air. Thank you so much, both of you. It's incredibly kind. All patrons receive a bundle of gaming material that I've written and the warm glow of knowing that they're funding my ongoing pop culture related breakdowns and keeping them ad-free. Now on with the show. War of the Worlds is one of those stories that's as much a reference point in popular culture as a story in its own right. Everyone knows how the alien invasion is ultimately brought down by the aliens failing to wash their hands after going to the toilet. Most people are aware of the urban legends surrounding the 1938 radio production starring Orson Welles, which allegedly caused people to fear that a real alien invasion was underway, a story that has definitely grown with the telling over the years. It's been adapted for the screen several times as both a film and a TV show, with the 1958 version with Ray Harryhausen special effects arguably being the best, infused as it is by a whopping dose of Cold War paranoia that makes the tale as relevant in 1958 as it was 60 years earlier, when it was fears of a German surprise attack that animated and underpinned the genre of speculative fiction known as invasion literature. A genre, by the way, which was widespread enough to be spoofed by P.G. Wodehouse. There was also a more recent BBC adaptation which kept the Victorian setting but tried to make it less male-dominated, which was a noble aim but didn't really land, not because there's anything hard to swallow about a Victorian woman rising to the challenge of exceptional circumstances, but because it wasn't very well made. There's also Jeff Wayne and his much-lauded musical adaptation, which is a wonderful rock opera, and I'd love to see it live one day. So it is a story that has received multiple adaptations and also multiple sequels, perhaps most notably Edison Conquers the Martians, which was thoroughly unauthorised but dealt with the sense of panic and helplessness in the face of external threat, which is everywhere in the original novel, by imagining that noted inventor and patent thug Thomas Edison would rise to the challenge of taking the fight to the Martians themselves and reasserting man's dominant position in the food chain. It's not good, but it is psychologically fascinating, and it might be worth an entire episode to itself at some point. There's also a more official sequel from the 90s called The Massacre of Mankind by British science fiction author Stephen Baxter, which was authorised by the Wells estate. That's a much more rational affair, which does a very good job of presenting a Victorian woman who lived through the first invasion, rising to the challenge of the Martians returning in the early 20th century. It's a very good book, actually, provided you don't mind characters with an incessant need to explain science to each other at the drop of a hat. There's also a whole bunch of other unofficial War of the Worlds sequels, but I would also like to call out a great comic book sequel called Scarlet Traces by Ian Edgington and Disraeli, which would later continue into a solar system spanning war narrative in the pages of 2000 AD. That one is particularly good. All of this is to say that there's no shortage of versions of War of the Worlds out there. It occupies an interesting point in the public consciousness, being immensely familiar in outline, but perhaps less familiar in specifics. Everyone knows how it ends, but how many people remember the character of the Guardsman and his garbled plans for an underground empire of humanity, which he'll get to as soon as he finishes his bottle of looted champagne? It's a book I absolutely love, which I reread earlier this year after watching a bootleg live recording of the stage show. It's a fantastic novel that's steeped in the trauma of colonialism, which uses science fiction to force 19th century Britain to confront their own impact on the nations they have conquered and tried to remake in their own cultural image. Even the role of disease in the narrative has links to the way malaria had a tendency to decimate colonial administrations. Which isn't to say that Wells was perfect. He was a product of his time and endorsed some thoroughly social Darwinist and eugenicist views of other cultures, but he was at least aware of the monstrous dislocation that violent colonialisation represented and sought to bring that trauma home to the people of Britain. I find the Asylum's take on War of the Worlds particularly interesting because it sticks surprisingly close to the plot outline of the original story, but refracts it through a thoroughly American lens. Thematically, this is the struggle of a heroic individual against almost impossible odds, whose ultimate vindication lies as much in the re-establishment of the nuclear family as in the bare act of survival. In the original novel, the protagonist is kind of there to record the action, and his survival is depicted as almost that of a dumb animal scavenging through the wreckage of civilization. There is little that is heroic in him, and he is caustic about the people he encounters, who each respond to the cataclysm in different ways. It's a book that is much more a horror novel than you might realise. It's utterly suffused with madness, death, and a sense of helplessness in the face of oblivion. Though there's elements of despair in the Asylum's movie, there's also a degree of hope as its hero attempts to fight back against the Martians in a way that expresses the quintessential question of American civilization: is a human being ultimately master of their own destiny? On top of that, I would argue it is also surprisingly good. Let's not get overexcited though, because surprisingly good is a distinctly relative plaudit. Imagine how good a film could be if it was made in 2 weeks on the budget of a TV episode, with special effects less good than most of Babylon 5. Imagine that most of the actors strongly vibe as though they were dragooned into their roles on the way back from the methadone clinic. It is exactly that good. Not good by any sane measure, but still surprisingly entertaining under the trying circumstances. It's like the time I saw a goth band live in the middle 2000s and they were all too drunk to stand up by the time they took the stage, but somehow managed to make it through their allotted time without completely collapsing, and the songs were basically recognisable and enjoyable-ish. It's exactly that good. The production is helped by having a really strong structure to fall back on. For all that there's a lot of big action set pieces in the novel, that an outfit like the Asylum is going to struggle to recreate, there's big chunks of it that involve the narrator just wandering about in a devastated landscape, and a whole section that's just hiding in a basement with a nutter. And if there's one thing you can do on a tiny budget, it's hiding in a basement with a nutter. A lot of the time, the Martian fighting machines are more of a presence than a driving narrative force, and so the Asylum movie has quite a lot of things that can be made to work on a shoestring while sticking fairly closely to the broad outline of the original novel, even though it does play fast and loose with some of the specifics. What you end up with is something that's recognisably War of the Worlds, even if it's also recognisably very cheap. You've got versions of some of the classic characters in a modernised and updated form. The character of the traumatised preacher being obsessed with the rapture speaks to a very 21st century form of religious angst. The elephant in the room here is the special effects, although perhaps the term visual effects might be more appropriate. These effects are not in the least bit special, though the fact that you can see them with your eyes definitely makes them visual. The kindest thing you can say is that the Martian fighting machines, being mechanical objects, are at least well suited to being rendered as CGI. The fact that they look like an Amiga tech demo from 1992 is harder to overlook, and the less said about the Martians themselves the better. There's a couple of moments where the effects sort of work, chiefly when it's so dark you can barely see them, when the fighting machines are just shapes looming over the landscape, but there's no escaping the fact that this is an ugly film. The thing is, I perversely prefer really shoddy CGI, because there's often an effort to only do effect shots when you have to. I remember seeing Green Lantern at the cinema because I hate myself on some profound and unsettling level, and being horrified by the last third being Ryan Reynolds' face smeared atop a grisly soup of obvious CGI nonsense. When you can afford to do everything with CGI, it can create a feeling of weightlessness throughout the movie. The Star Wars prequels were particularly bad for this. In some ways, I'd rather have to really work to suspend my disbelief for a few short sections than constantly have this annoying background hum of everything being slightly unreal. The way the effects are deployed here, there's at least some thought gone into using them to enhance the narrative. Sure, the outcome is that it makes the film look absurdly crude, but I can at least appreciate what they were trying to do. In terms of the cast and crew, there's some faintly interesting things to look at. It's actually directed by one of the co-founders of the Asylum, David Michael Latt. With over 350 producer credits to his name, Latt is astoundingly prolific, but he's actually only directed 9 films over the course of his career, none of them well received. War of the Worlds was his penultimate film behind the camera, only to be followed by Mega Fault in 2009, which was a made-for-TV disaster movie. He brings little flair or panache to the direction, but you do at least get the impression that he had some kind of vision for the overall film. He also co-wrote the script, and I think a certain familiarity and appreciation for the source material shows through. There's an earnestness to things that speaks of a degree of reverence for Wells' novel, and that does come through in the final cut. It's not well directed by any means, but there is a core competence in the art of filmmaking that keeps things moving along. Latt is aided in his endeavours by a core cast that is actually slightly better than he probably deserves. The lead is played by H Thomas Howell, who brings 2 things to the film. The first is a safe pair of hands in that he's an actor who knows how to act for the screen. He's been in all kinds of films over the years and has voluminous experience working at many different budgets. He was the protagonist in The Hitcher opposite Rutger Hauer, one of the most emotionally draining horror movies I've ever seen, and also one of the best. He was also Tyler in E.T. and has 230 other credits on IMDb. He was recovering from illness when he made this film in 2005, which is unfortunate as his sallow and gaunt appearance detracts from the everyman vibe he would otherwise have been able to project. Whether deliberately or not, his visible frailty in the production enhances for me that central tension in the film about whether an American man, and it is always a man, can triumph in the face of adversity and reclaim for himself the nuclear family that is the apogee of the American dream. There's some other experienced hands on this production as well, and they were certainly money well spent. Andy Lauer and Peter Green deliver some solid work in key roles, and it's always a pleasure to see Jake Busey and his professionally wild eyes. There's a vague sense of the cast being a little bit on the edge of some kind of breakdown, which, if the Asylum's shooting schedule is everything the rumours say it is, might well be true. Nonetheless, any low-budget film is elevated by the presence of actors who know their craft. It's a very male-dominated film, but Tinari Van Wyck Lutz does her best as H Thomas Howell's long-suffering wife. I think recasting some of the other characters as women would have been a good idea. Several of the characters, particularly the emotionally fragile preacher driven to madness by the horrors of the Martian invasion, could easily have been written for a woman. Overall, War of the Worlds has modest ambitions to hit some of the easier film beats of the novel and to recontextualise them around a more action-oriented American hero. It's very definitely a film that premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel in 2005, but for me it's at the more enjoyable end of that scale. I should note I can't compare it either favourably or unfavourably to Steven Spielberg's version of the story because I haven't seen it. I did consider watching it before writing this episode, but honestly it felt more authentic to watch this version instead of the actual blockbuster rather than alongside the blockbuster. It better replicates that feeling of getting to the video store and all the copies of the actual film you wanted to see have been rented, but there's something that looks a bit like the film you wanted to see if you squint, so that's the one you rent and you kind of just hope for the best. This is going to be a running theme in this series, I think. My appetite for big-budget Hollywood blockbusters has never been huge, and it's only attenuated further with the passing of years. I'd honestly rather watch the mockbuster much of the time, a lifestyle choice I may well have cause to regret as this series develops. Next time, we're going to be looking at another early Asylum film, this one an original horror movie rather than a mockbuster, but one that's still jumping on an existing bandwagon in low-budget cinema. I do hope you'll join me for that. If you want to get in touch in the meantime, maybe to suggest a specific Asylum film you'd like me to cover, you can do so via email by writing to hjdoomretrofun, all one word, @gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky. Thank you very much for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.